Imagine being 31,000 feet in the air, surrounded by strangers, when a simple request to use the bathroom turns into a life-altering confrontation. Dr. Maya Collins, a world-renowned aerospace medicine expert, wasn't asking for luxury, just dignity. Yet in that narrow aisle of Ascend Airlines Flight 1321, her humanity was challenged in the most humiliating way. Why would a flight attendant deny a passenger in obvious medical distress? What happens when arrogance meets the wrong person? Someone who not only knows the rules, but helped write them. And how could 10 minutes, just 10 minutes, ignite a chain reaction, powerful enough to shake an entire airline to its core? This isn't just about one woman and one flight. It's about power, prejudice, and the devastating consequences of underestimating the person sitting quietly beside you. Stay with us, because what began as a denial in the sky would descend into a public reckoning no one on that plane could have imagined. If this story moves you, don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel so you'll never miss more true stories of justice, dignity, and unbelievable real-life karma. Dr. Maya Collins settled into her seat on Ascend Airlines Flight 1321, preparing for another routine trip from Los Angeles to New York. It had been a long week of meetings, lectures, and consulting for aerospace medicine. Her specialty, and all she wanted, was to catch a few hours of sleep before arriving at her next destination. Maya was used to traveling. As a renowned specialist in aerospace medicine, she was often crisscrossing the country, consulting for the FAA and advising on the physiological impacts of long-haul flights on the human body. At 40, Maya had already established herself as a powerful force in her field, respected for her expertise and unflappable demeanor. But today, this routine flight felt different. There was something in the air, something about the way the flight attendants moved down the aisles, their eyes flicking briefly over passengers as they checked their seat belts. Maya shrugged it off. She wasn't one to focus on the small things. Her mind was focused on the upcoming presentation she had in New York, the research she'd been gathering on the effects of high-altitude flight on cardiovascular health. She'd be fine. Just a few more hours, and then she could catch up on some much-needed rest. As the plane ascended, the usual hum of the engines became a constant backdrop. Maya closed her eyes, leaning back against the plush headrest. Beside her, her husband, David, a corporate litigator, was engrossed in a thick legal brief, tapping his pen thoughtfully against his cheek as he read through the latest case documents. They made a good pair, Maya's calm intellect paired with David's sharp legal mind. They had built their lives together on a foundation of shared respect and ambition. Around 3 hours into the flight, Maya began to feel an all-too-familiar discomfort. A sudden, urgent pressure in her abdomen made it clear that she needed to use the restroom. Maya had been dealing with a mild autoimmune condition for the past few months, and though it was manageable, it came with the occasional inconvenient flare-up. This time, the urge was sharp and immediate. She needed to go. She unbuckled her seatbelt, glancing over at David. "I'll be right back," she murmured, her voice calm despite the rising discomfort. David glanced up, nodding absently, before returning to his documents. Maya walked toward the back of the cabin, making her way through the aisles of the plane. It wasn't a long walk, but with every step, the pressure intensified, and she quickened her pace. When Maya reached the galley, she saw the flight attendant standing there, clipboard in hand. Her name tag read Jenna. Jenna was a young woman, likely in her 20s, with blonde hair tied back in a neat ponytail and a smile that was polite but not quite warm. Maya approached, hoping for a quick resolution to her situation. "Excuse me," Maya said, her voice soft but firm. "Could you let me through? I need to use the restroom." She gestured toward the back of the plane, where the restrooms were located. Jenna's eyes flickered over Maya, a brief but obvious look of assessment. It was a fleeting glance, but Maya felt it, the subtle judgment, the silent calculation. Jenna gave a quick nod, raising her hand in a stop motion, the kind you might use to halt traffic. "The lavatory is closed right now, ma'am," Jenna said, her tone polite but dismissive. Maya frowned, momentarily stunned. The flight had been smooth, and the seatbelt sign was off. She glanced at the sign above the door. It was marked vacant. "Is there a maintenance issue?" she asked. Her voice calm, but with an edge of confusion. "We're beginning our initial preparations for descent," Jenna replied, her voice crisp, and her eyes avoided meeting Maya's. "The captain wants the cabin secured." Maya's frown deepened. She glanced up at the overhead monitors. There was no sign of descent. They were still well over an hour away from New York. This wasn't right. She knew the procedures, had been on enough flights to recognize when a rule was being bent or misapplied. "With all due respect," Maya said, trying to maintain her composure, "we're still quite far from our destination. I have a medical need to use the restroom. It will only take a moment." Jenna's expression remained unchanged, but her eyes narrowed slightly, the flicker of impatience now visible. "As I said," she repeated, her voice becoming more clipped, "we're preparing for descent. You'll need to return to your seat." Maya was taken aback. This was no longer about a simple bathroom break. She could feel the frustration building inside her, the palpable injustice of it, the underlying power dynamic. It was just a bathroom, a basic human need. But somehow, it had become an issue of authority, of control. Despite the growing discomfort, Maya took a deep breath. She recognized the subtle power play at work, how Jenna was using the flimsy excuse of procedures to assert her authority over someone who she likely assumed didn't have the power to challenge her. Maya's first instinct was to argue, to press her case further. But something inside her told her that escalating the situation would only make things worse. She didn't want to create a scene, didn't want to add fuel to the fire. Instead, she nodded slowly, her movements graceful and deliberate, masking the growing pain in her abdomen. "Very well," she said, her voice soft but carrying a sense of finality. "I'll return to my seat." She turned away, walking back toward her place. David looked up from his legal brief as she reached the seat, his brow furrowed in concern when he saw the tense expression on her face. "Everything okay, Maya?" he asked quietly. Maya exhaled slowly, sitting down beside him. "The flight attendant has refused to let me use the lavatory," she said, keeping her voice steady, though there was an edge of frustration underneath. David's brow furrowed further. "On what grounds?" he asked, his voice tight. "She says they're preparing for descent," Maya replied, "but we're still well over an hour from landing." She paused, trying to steady her breath. "She wasn't interested in my medical need. She threatened to report me as non-compliant." David's jaw clenched. As a lawyer, he recognized the dangerous mix of ignorance and authority. His protective instincts kicked in. "Okay," he said, his voice low but firm. "We're not done with this." Maya's eyes closed for a moment, the pain in her abdomen intensifying. She couldn't decide what to do. She had always prided herself on being calm under pressure. But this was different. She wasn't just being inconvenienced. She was being ignored, dismissed, disrespected. But she also knew that responding with anger wasn't the answer. Not yet. There was a bigger game to play here. A longer game. Maya wasn't going to let this go. Not when she knew her rights. Not when she knew how the system worked. As she sat there, the discomfort growing, she made a choice. The steady hum of the aircraft should have been comforting, the rhythmic sound that usually lulled passengers into a sense of calm. But for Dr. Maya Collins, each vibration beneath her feet only reminded her of the growing pressure inside her body. The ache was no longer a background annoyance. It was becoming sharper, more urgent. She sat upright, breathing slowly, trying to keep her face composed, while David's sharp eyes studied her in silence. "Tell me exactly what happened," he said, his tone calm but edged with the kind of controlled fury Maya had come to know well. "She stopped me before I could even open the door," Maya said, her voice low, careful not to let the passengers around them overhear. She claimed they're preparing for descent, but the flight map clearly shows we're over Pennsylvania. It's not even close to the time. David's pen tapped against the armrest, a rhythm of thought. "That's absurd. Did you tell her it was medical?" Maya nodded. She didn't care. She wasn't interested in hearing anything more once I said that. She threatened to report me for noncompliance. David leaned back, his eyes narrowing as if he were cross-examining the situation in his head. Noncompliance. For needing to use a bathroom that's beyond absurd. That's abuse of authority. Maya pressed her lips together, trying to mask the wave of pain that passed through her. It wasn't just physical anymore. It was emotional. She had dealt with dismissive glances and veiled judgments before, but this moment felt different. It wasn't a shrug. It wasn't subtle. It was deliberate, sharp, and meant to remind her that she was not in control. She leaned back in her seat, staring at the overhead light. For a fleeting second, she wondered if she was overreacting. Maybe Jenna was just following a strict interpretation of the rules. Maybe she was just having a bad day. But then she thought back to the way Jenna's eyes had flickered over her, the unspoken evaluation. The hesitation wasn't about policy, it was about power. And worse, it felt personal. The voice of the captain came over the intercom, cheerful and calm. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are cruising smoothly at 37,000 feet. We'll be making our descent into New York in about 90 minutes. Weather is clear and we're expecting an on-time arrival." Maya's eyes snapped open. 90 minutes, not 10, not 30-90. The captain's own words had just proven Jenna's explanation false. David heard it too, and his jaw flexed visibly as he looked toward the back of the cabin. "You see," he whispered, "she lied. That wasn't procedure. That was personal." Maya inhaled deeply. The sting of injustice was worse than the pain in her abdomen. She felt it radiating through her, hot and insistent. For a moment, she wondered if she should just get up again, walk firmly to the restroom, and insist. But she knew how that would look. The flight attendant would frame her as disruptive, maybe even call in the captain or threaten law enforcement upon landing. She couldn't risk giving them that weapon. Instead, Maya turned inward. She thought of the countless times she had told her medical students and FAA colleagues that dignity mattered as much as safety in the skies. Passengers weren't cargo. They were people, and they deserved to be treated as such. And here she was, denied that dignity in the most basic form. David placed his hand over hers. "You don't have to put up with this," he said softly. Maya gave him a look, her eyes filled with calm intensity. "I know, but I also know what happens when people like me push too hard. The story changes. I stop being the professional, the doctor, the consultant, and I become the angry black woman, disrupting a flight, And that's all anyone remembers. David's chest rose and fell, his protective instinct battling with his logical mind. He wanted to stand up, march to the galley, and demand justice. But Maya's restraint reminded him why he admired her so deeply. She wasn't just strong, she was strategic. Still, the pain continued to gnaw at her. She shifted in her seat, pressing a hand lightly against her abdomen. She thought about her condition, about the medications that kept her symptoms manageable, but came with brutal side effects. It wasn't vanity or convenience, it was necessity. And that necessity was being ignored. Passengers around them began to notice. A man across the aisle lowered his newspaper, watching quietly. A young woman 2 rows ahead turned her head slightly, her earbuds dangling from one ear as if she were listening in. Maya felt their eyes on her, not out of malice, but curiosity. They had seen the brief confrontation. They knew something wasn't right. The humiliation burned deeper. It wasn't just that she was in pain. It was that she was being made into a spectacle. And Jenna, smug in her authority, had walked away as though she'd won some invisible battle. Maya closed her eyes for a moment, willing herself to breathe. She thought of her mother, who had taught her that dignity was a shield. "Never let them see you break," her mother had said, "because your strength will always unsettle them more than your anger." But in this moment, Maya wasn't sure which path to take. Strength through composure, or strength through confrontation. She imagined herself standing up, raising her voice, forcing Jenna to face the truth. She imagined the passengers rallying to her side, perhaps even applauding her courage. But she also imagined the headlines, the whispers, disruptive passenger, difficult woman. She imagined being reduced to a caricature, stripped of her identity as a doctor, a consultant, a professional. Her heart ached at the unfairness of it all. Why should she have to choose between dignity and her health? Why should she have to weigh her identity against her humanity? David leaned in, his voice a whisper only she could hear. "You've spent your life working to improve this industry. You've saved lives, Maya, and they're treating you like you don't matter." Maya opened her eyes, meeting his gaze. "That's the problem," she said quietly. "They don't know who I am. They just see who they think I am." The silence between them was heavy. Maya's mind raced, searching for a way forward. She could sit here in pain, let the humiliation fester, and endure until they landed. Or she could act, using not her voice, but her knowledge and connections. She had spent her career building credibility, forging relationships at the highest levels of aviation authority. Perhaps now was the moment to use it. She glanced back toward the galley, where Jenna stood chatting with another attendant, Megan, their laughter light, as if nothing significant had just happened. The sight made Maya's stomach turn, not just from the pain, but from the casual cruelty. She turned back to David, her decision crystallizing. "I'm not going to argue with her again," she said, her voice steady. "I'll take another route." David studied her face, recognizing the look in her eyes. It was the look she wore in the courtroom of ideas, at FAA conferences when she dismantled flawed arguments with surgical precision. He knew that look meant Jenna had just picked the wrong person to underestimate. "What are you going to do?" he asked. Maya leaned back, her hand slipping into her bag. Her fingers brushed against the smooth surface of her second phone, her work phone, encrypted and secure. She exhaled, the weight of her decision pressing down on her chest. "I'm going to remind them," she said softly, "that the rules they're hiding behind were written by people like me." David's lips pressed into a thin line. He nodded once, understanding. Do it. The ache in her body had reached a fever pitch, but in her mind, a new clarity emerged. This wasn't just about her bladder. This wasn't just about the pain. This was about principle, about justice, about refusing to be diminished in the very environment she had dedicated her life to improving. The tension in the cabin thickened, invisible but palpable. Passengers sensed something was happening, though they couldn't yet see its full shape. Maya sat perfectly still, her exterior calm, her interior aflame with both pain and resolve. She was no longer just enduring. She was preparing. The next move would not be loud. It would not be dramatic. It would be precise, devastating, and impossible to ignore. And the countdown to that moment had already begun. The minutes dragged on like hours. Doctor, Maya Collins shifted in her seat, trying to find some posture that might lessen the pressure inside her abdomen. But nothing helped. Every breath seemed to tighten the discomfort, pressing down on her patience. David's hand rested over hers, steady and reassuring. But even his presence couldn't distract her from the gnawing urgency. She knew the science of what was happening. She could almost visualize it as though she were reviewing a case study, her medication's diuretic effect accelerating fluid pressure, her bladder stretching against the clock. She had taught medical residents about similar scenarios, warning them how quickly a manageable situation could escalate into a dangerous one if ignored. Now she was the patient, and the irony was bitter on her tongue. I can't sit here much longer, Maya whispered. Her voice carried a trace of strain that David hadn't heard from her in years, not even during the late nights when her autoimmune symptoms had flared worse than this. Then we'll try again, David said firmly. This time, I'll go with you. Maya hesitated. She didn't want to create a spectacle. She had worked too hard to cultivate her professional image, an image of calm authority, not confrontation. Yet the pain was becoming unbearable, and her rational mind couldn't justify waiting another 90 minutes. Okay, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Together. They stood. The aisle was narrow, filled with passengers shifting their legs, pulling earbuds out, glancing up with faint curiosity. Maya felt their eyes as she walked past, David just behind her. She hated being the focus of attention, hated that this simple human need had become something visible, public, and fraught. When they reached the galley, Jenna was still there, leaning against the counter as she jotted notes on her clipboard. Her posture was casual, but the glance she shot at Maya and David was sharp, guarded. "Excuse me," David began, his tone polite but measured, the way he might address a witness on the stand. "My wife has a medical condition. She urgently needs to use the restroom. I'd like you to unlock it immediately." Jenna blinked, her smile tightening, but her voice came crisp and practiced. "Sir, as I explained earlier, we're preparing for descent. The lavatories are closed." David's expression didn't waver. "With respect, that is not true. The captain just announced we have 90 minutes before landing. I know the procedures as well as you do. There is no valid reason to deny her this basic access." Jenna's gaze flickered to Maya, then back to David, her lips pressed together in a thin line. "Sir, you need to return to your seat. If you continue to press this, I will have to report both of you as non-compliant." The word hung in the air like a threat. Non-compliant. David bristled, but Maya touched his arm gently, her signal for restraint. "I am a physician," Maya said, her tone quiet but firm. "My specialty is aerospace medicine. I consult for the FAA. I am telling you that this is not optional. It is a medical necessity. You are not following proper regulations. For the first time." Jenna's expression cracked. Surprise flickered in her eyes, quickly masked by defensiveness. She shifted her stance, as though bracing herself. "Ma'am, claiming to be an FAA consultant is a serious statement. I'd be careful." The condescension in her tone was unmistakable. Maya felt the sting of it, not just as an insult to her credentials, but as a dismissal of her very identity. She had delivered testimony to congressional committees, written reports that shaped industry regulations, and guided medical policy that saved lives midair. Yet here she was, being brushed aside as if she were just another passenger trying to bend the rules. Behind Jenna, another attendant stepped forward. This one was older, with tired eyes and the kind of seasoned authority that came from decades in the skies. Her name tag read Megan Walsh. She carried herself differently, less eager, more burdened. "Is there a problem here?" Megan asked, her voice even, but cool. "Yes," David said quickly. "Your colleague has refused to let my wife use the lavatory, despite her medical need and despite the fact that we're nowhere near descent. She's in significant discomfort. This is unacceptable." Megan looked at Jenna briefly, and the glance between them was telling. It wasn't confusion, it was solidarity. Then she turned back to Maya and David. "I'm afraid Jenna is correct," Megan said smoothly. "We need the cabin secured. The lavatories are not available." Maya's heart sank. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was coordinated. They had decided she was the problem, and they were standing together to assert control. She met Megan's eyes, searching for even a flicker of empathy, but all she found was cold detachment. Megan leaned in slightly, lowering her voice to a near whisper meant only for Maya. "Look," Megan said, her tone laced with warning. "It's been a long flight for all of us. Don't make this a bigger issue than it needs to be. Just sit back and wait until we land." Maya froze. The words weren't just dismissive, they were threatening. She wasn't being asked to comply with policy. She was being told to disappear, to silence herself, to shrink. A surge of humiliation rushed through her. She thought of every lecture she had given about dignity in the skies, every time she had told trainees that fairness and compassion mattered more than rigid procedure. And here she was, treated as less than human by the very system she had worked to improve. Her abdomen throbbed, pain radiating outward until it was almost dizzying. David's hand tightened on her shoulder, grounding her. He was seething, but Maya could see the calculation in his eyes. He knew that pushing harder here would only escalate things in their favor. They'd spin the narrative. Two unruly passengers, making trouble midair. The power imbalance was undeniable. Slowly, deliberately. Maya nodded. "Very well," she said again, her voice soft but steady. "If that is your final position, then I'll return to my seat." The attendants exchanged a look that was half relief, half smugness. They thought they had won. They thought they had shut her down. But as Maya turned back toward the aisle, her body screaming in protest, something inside her shifted. The humiliation was no longer just a wound. It was fuel. She had endured the dismissal, the lies, the veiled prejudice. Now she was done enduring. She eased back into her seat, her face calm despite the storm inside her. David leaned close, his voice low. "You can't keep letting them do this." "I won't," Maya whispered, her tone threaded with steel. "But I'm not going to fight them here. Not on their terms. I'll fight them where they can't hide." Her hand slipped into her bag, fingers brushing the familiar weight of her work phone. The device was encrypted, its secure line a lifeline between her and the officials who trusted her judgment without hesitation. She could feel the decision solidifying inside her. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about every passenger who had ever been dismissed, belittled, or humiliated by people who wielded authority like a weapon. The ache in her abdomen made her grimace, but her mind was clear. She wasn't powerless. She had knowledge, she had connections, and she had the truth on her side. As David watched her, recognition dawned in his eyes. He had seen her in this mode before in conference rooms, in heated debates, in high-stakes negotiations where the calmest person always won. He knew that look meant the tide was turning. "Are you sure you want to do this?" he asked softly. Maya met his gaze. Her expression was serene, but her eyes burned with resolve. "I don't want to," she said quietly, "but I have to." The passengers around them stirred as the beverage cart rattled down the aisle. To everyone else, it was just another flight. But for Maya Collins, this moment marked a shift. The lines had been drawn, the stakes set. The attendants thought they had silenced her. They had no idea what storm was about to break. The quiet drone of the engines filled the cabin, a backdrop to the tension pulsing just beneath the surface. "Dr." Maya Collins sat rigidly in her seat, her hands folded carefully in her lap. Every muscle in her body was taut with restraint, her abdomen throbbing with a sharp urgency that refused to be ignored. Yet her face remained composed, a mask of calm she had perfected over years of navigating boardrooms, conferences, and sometimes unspoken prejudice. David sat beside her, his eyes dark with fury, his jaw clenched and unclenched as he tapped his pen against the legal brief still open on his lap. To anyone else, it might have looked like absent-minded habit. Maya knew better. It was his way of holding back, of containing the storm building inside him. "This isn't right," David whispered, his voice low, measured. "They can't get away with this?" Maya turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze. Her eyes carried both exhaustion and clarity. "They already have. David, at least, that's what they think." David exhaled sharply, his frustration palpable. "You're in pain. You told them it was medical. That's not just bad service, that's negligence. If this were a courtroom, I'd bury them. But we're not in a courtroom," Maya said softly, her lips curving into a bitter half-smile. "We're 37,000 feet in the air. And up here, perception is power. They frame the story, not us." David leaned back, shaking his head. "I should go talk to the captain." "No," Maya interrupted firmly, gripping his hand. "Not yet. If you go now, they'll say we're escalating. They'll brand us as disruptive, and then we lose any leverage we might have." The words stung because they were true. Maya knew exactly how this played out. She had seen similar stories in the news, had read case reports of passengers removed from flights under vague accusations of non-compliance. Once that label stuck, the truth rarely mattered. Still, the weight of injustice pressed on her chest as heavily as the physical pain in her abdomen. She couldn't shake the memory of Jenna's dismissive eyes, the smug way Megan had leaned in to whisper her warning. It hadn't been about safety, not even about procedure. It had been about control, about putting her in her place. Her mind replayed the moment like a cruel loop. She thought of her medical students, bright-eyed and eager, asking how to handle ethical dilemmas in clinical practice. She always told them compassion first, procedure second. And here she was, stripped of that compassion by people who saw her not as a physician, not as an expert, but as a nuisance. The humiliation gnawed at her. For a moment, she questioned herself. Was she overanalyzing? Maybe Jenna was just strict about rules. Maybe Megan was tired, burnt out after years of flying. Maybe this wasn't personal. But then she remembered the glance, that flicker of judgment, that microsecond where Jenna's gaze had traveled over her braided hair, her brown skin, her steady posture, and dismissed her all the same. It wasn't about fatigue. It wasn't about descent prep. It was prejudice, plain and simple, cloaked in the thinnest veneer of authority. Maya closed her eyes, exhaling slowly, steadying her breathing. Pain radiated outward, but behind it was a growing flame anger. Yes, but also something sharper. Resolve. She thought about the irony. She had devoted her life to studying the very conditions of flight, advising airlines and the FAA on medical protocols designed to prevent crises. She had written papers about the importance of addressing in-flight medical needs swiftly, had testified about how small oversights could snowball into emergencies. And now, those warnings were being ignored against her. David's hand tightened on hers, grounding her again. "Say the word," he murmured, "and I'll make sure they regret this." Maya opened her eyes and turned to him. Her voice was calm, but her eyes glinted with quiet fire. "Not with anger," she said, "with precision." The words settled between them like a pact. Across the aisle, a man who had been watching the earlier confrontation shifted in his seat. He whispered something to the woman beside him, who glanced back at Maya with wide, sympathetic eyes. Maya caught the look and offered a small, polite nod. The passengers had noticed. The story was already taking shape among them, piece by piece. But sympathy alone wouldn't fix this. Sympathy wouldn't erase the pain in her abdomen or the condescension she had endured. Sympathy wouldn't hold Jenna and Megan accountable for their choices. No, this needed more than sympathy. It needed consequences. Maya leaned back, her hand slipping once more into her bag. The smooth weight of her encrypted phone pressed against her fingers, a silent reminder of the connections she carried. She thought of Miles Peterson, the FAA Deputy Administrator for Aviation Safety. She had worked with him on fatigue research, had sat across from him in sterile conference rooms, dissecting data until late into the night. He trusted her judgment. He knew her voice carried weight. For a moment, she hesitated. Was this too drastic? Was she about to cross a line she couldn't uncross? A voice in her head whispered doubt. What if people thought she was abusing her position? What if the headlines twisted her actions, painting her as vindictive rather than justified? But then another thought rose, steadier, stronger. What if she stayed silent? What if she let this humiliation pass, endured the pain, and walked away? What would that teach Jenna? What would that teach Megan? What would it teach every other flight attendant who watched and thought, this is how power is supposed to be used? Her mother's voice echoed in her mind again. Never let them see you break. But maybe this wasn't about not breaking. Maybe it was about showing that she refused to bend. She pulled the phone from her bag, her movements deliberate, her face expressionless. To the casual observer, it might have looked like she was simply checking her messages. Jenna and Megan, glancing down the aisle from their galley, didn't seem concerned. They thought it was harmless. They thought she had accepted defeat. They had no idea. David leaned closer, his voice barely audible. "Are you sure?" "Yes," Maya whispered. Her thumbs flew across the screen with clinical precision, each word sharp, measured, undeniable. She drafted her message not as a complaint, but as a report concise, factual, threaded with the language of regulation. To Miles Peterson, FAA Deputy Administrator for Aviation Safety. Subject: urgent in-flight safety and medical incident. From Dr. Maya Collins. Details: Ascend Airlines Flight 11321 Los Angeles to New York. Passenger with Level 2 medical necessity denied lavatory access despite seatbelt sign off. Crew members Jenna and Megan citing false descent prep. Regulatory violation. 14 CFR Part 121. Passenger safety compromised. Immediate intervention requested. She read it twice, her eyes steady, then hit send. The timestamp glowed on the screen, 2:13 A single checkmark appeared delivered. Maya exhaled, her chest loosening slightly despite the pain. The wheels were in motion now, far beyond Jenna's control. This wasn't about arguing in an aisle or begging for dignity. This was about exposing truth to the one authority that mattered. David looked at her with a mix of awe and pride. 10 minutes, Maya murmured, her lips barely moving. That's all it will take. And as the plane cruised smoothly through the skies, the countdown began. The hum of the engines continued, steady and indifferent, as if nothing unusual was happening aboard Ascend Airlines Flight 1321. To most passengers, it was still an ordinary cross-country flight, a blur of recycled air, cramped seats, and half-watched movies. But for Dr. Maya Collins, those 10 minutes after she pressed send on her encrypted message stretched into something else entirely. A crucible of pain, anticipation, and resolve. She leaned back, eyes closed, her breathing slow and deliberate. Every nerve in her abdomen throbbed with the same insistent rhythm pressure. Pressure, pressure. She had managed worse before. As a doctor, she understood pain not just as sensation, but as data. She cataloged it clinically sharp, constant, radiating, but she also knew her body wasn't an abstract case study. It was real, and it was screaming for relief. Beside her, David kept his gaze fixed on the flight map, though his mind was clearly elsewhere. His hand tightened around hers, his grip a promise of solidarity. "It's done now," he whispered. "The message is sent. All we can do is wait." Maya nodded faintly. Waiting had never been her strength. In the hospital, she thrived in urgency decisions made quickly, efficiently. Lives changed in the span of a heartbeat. But here, locked inside a metal tube hurtling across the sky, waiting was the only option. And yet, this wasn't passive waiting. This was charged, deliberate. She knew exactly who had just received her message. Miles Peterson didn't waste time. He couldn't afford to. Maya had seen him work before, had watched him dismantle bureaucratic inertia with a few clipped sentences. He wasn't the type to brush off a report, especially not one written in precise regulatory language by a consultant whose expertise he trusted. She imagined him now, sitting in his office at FAA headquarters in Washington, D.C., his tidy desk piled with reports, the buzz of his encrypted phone vibrating against the wood, his sharp eyes narrowing as he read her words. She pictured the shift in his posture, the way his shoulders squared when something serious landed on his desk. Her lips curved into the faintest smile. She knew him well enough to know he would act. David leaned closer. "Do you think they'll realize what you did?" Maya opened her eyes, glancing down the aisle. Jenna and Megan were still stationed near the galley, chatting quietly. Jenna's laughter rang out, sharp and grating. They hadn't noticed a thing. They thought the situation was over, resolved in their favor. They thought Maya had bowed her head and accepted their authority. "They won't realize until it's too late," Maya murmured. Her phone buzzed softly in her lap. She angled the screen discreetly. A reply. Short, Direct. Received. Stand by. 2 words, but enough to steady her pulse. Enough to remind her that this wasn't in vain. David caught the flicker in her expression. That was him, yes. The relief in his eyes was immediate, but it was tempered with concern. What happens now? Maya exhaled. Now the clock runs out. The first ripple came 5 minutes later, subtle but undeniable. The plane's smooth trajectory shifted slightly as the engines adjusted. Passengers barely noticed, but Maya did. She leaned her head toward David, whispering, "They're vectoring us." David's brows furrowed. Already she nodded. They're not waiting for the crew to act. The order came from higher. The overhead monitors flickered, updating their progress across the map. Instead of the straight line toward New York, the little airplane icon curved eastward, veering sharply. Confusion began to stir among the passengers. A man 2 rows ahead squinted at the screen. "Hey, aren't we supposed to be heading northeast?" he asked his seatmate. His words spread like sparks. Heads turned. Murmurs rippled. Maya stayed silent, watching, waiting. Moments later, the captain's voice filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Due to an unexpected passenger medical issue, we've been instructed to divert to Chicago O'Hare. We'll be landing there shortly for medical assistance. Please remain calm and follow crew instructions as we prepare for arrival." A hush fell over the cabin. The announcement carried no panic, but its weight was unmistakable. Diversions didn't happen without reason. David turned to Maya, astonishment written across his face. That fast Maya gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. 10 minutes, she said softly. Across the aisle. The man with the newspaper lowered it completely now, whispering to his wife. "I bet it's that woman they wouldn't let use the bathroom," he said, tilting his head toward Maya. His wife's eyes widened. "Are you serious? She's been in pain for a while. I saw the whole thing." Their voices weren't loud, but in the close quarters of the cabin, others overheard. The whispers grew. Passengers connected the dots: the earlier confrontation, the captain's announcement, the subtle curve of the flight path. The narrative crystallized, and it didn't favor the crew. Maya felt the shift like a change in air pressure. She didn't look around, didn't acknowledge it, but she knew the truth was spreading. Meanwhile, Jenna's face had gone pale. She glanced at Megan, her earlier smugness gone. "Medical issue," she whispered, too harshly to hide. "What medical issue?" Megan's jaw tightened. "Stay calm. It's probably nothing. Just coincidence." But Jenna wasn't convinced. She looked down the aisle, her eyes locking briefly on Maya. The sight made Maya's stomach twist, but she held the gaze, her expression serene. She didn't need to say a word. The engines lowered in pitch as the plane began its descent. Outside, the faint grid of Chicago appeared beneath scattered clouds. Passengers pressed their faces to windows, murmuring with curiosity. Inside, the tension was electric. Megan finally approached Maya and David, her composure strained. "Ma'am, sir," she said, her voice low but firm, "are you experiencing a medical emergency?" David's eyes flashed with disbelief. "You're asking that now." Megan's lips pressed into a tight line. "I need to understand the nature of what's happening." Maya's voice was calm, deliberate. "I told you earlier, it is a medical necessity. You dismissed me." The quiet authority in her tone was sharper than any accusation. Megan flinched as though struck. Passengers nearby heard the exchange. The man with the newspaper leaned forward, glaring openly at Megan. A woman in the row behind shook her head, muttering, "Unbelievable." The weight of the cabin's judgment settled on the attendants like a physical force. Megan's confidence faltered, but she didn't respond. She simply turned on her heel and retreated toward the galley, her posture stiff. David exhaled slowly, shaking his head. Now they're scared. Maya didn't answer. Her abdomen still throbbed with painful urgency, but beneath the discomfort was something else, vindication. The plane banked again, lining up with O'Hare's sprawling runways. As the cabin prepared for landing, Maya allowed herself one small thought: the system was working. Not because of kindness, not because of compassion, but because she had forced it to. For Jenna and Megan, ignorance had been bliss. For 10 minutes, they had believed they had won. Now the countdown had ended, and their world was about to collapse. The nose of the aircraft tilted downward ever so slightly as the captain initiated descent. To most passengers, the change was subtle, an almost imperceptible shift in engine pitch, the faint tug of gravity as drinks in plastic cups trembled. But for those attuned to the rhythms of flight, like Dr. Maya Collins, it was unmistakable. This wasn't the gentle preparation for New York she had anticipated. This was something far more urgent. David noticed it too. He leaned close, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're really doing it. They're diverting." Maya's lips pressed into a thin line. "I told you, Miles doesn't waste time." Her abdomen burned with pressure, but her mind sharpened with clarity. She knew what would happen next. The FAA didn't order diversions lightly. If Chicago O'Hare was their destination now, it meant the order had bypassed the crew entirely. The cabin attendants were no longer in control of the story. The truth had leapt far beyond their reach. Up front, in the cockpit, Captain Evelyn Rourke tightened her grip on the yoke. A 25-year veteran, she had guided aircraft through storms, mechanical malfunctions, even mid-air medical crises. But this an order from air traffic control citing passenger medical emergency without prior crew input was rare. Alarming. Her first officer, Daniel Price, furrowed his brow as he read back the instructions. Chicago Center, confirmed diversion to O'Hare. Passenger medical emergency. Copy. His voice was steady, but his hand shook slightly on the radio panel. Captain Rourke glanced at him, then back at the navigation display. "What the hell's going on in the back?" Daniel hesitated. "We didn't get any reports. No call from the cabin crew." Her eyes narrowed. "None at all. No captain. Nothing." Her stomach sank. In her decades of flying, she had trusted her cabin crew to escalate medical issues appropriately. The system was designed for communication, a sick passenger, a call to the cockpit, a consultation with ground-based physicians, and then, if necessary, a diversion. For air traffic control to step in meant one thing. Someone else with authority had raised the alarm. She pressed the intercom. "Lead flight attendant to the cockpit, now," in the galley. Megan stiffened. She shot a quick glance at Jenna, whose face had drained of color. "She wants me," Megan muttered, straightening her uniform before walking briskly to the flight deck. Jenna stayed rooted, her hands twisting around the edges of her clipboard. Her earlier bravado was gone. She looked down the aisle toward Maya, who sat quietly, eyes closed, hands folded, the picture of calm under duress. For the first time, Jenna felt something foreign gnawing at her chest. Fear. Inside the cockpit. Megan pushed through the reinforced door. "Captain," she asked, forcing a professional tone. Captain Rourke didn't look up from her instruments. "What's going on in my cabin?" Megan blinked. "Excuse me. We've just been ordered to divert to Chicago for a passenger medical emergency," the captain said. Her voice clipped. I've had no report from you. No call. No update. What medical issue am I missing? Megan's throat went dry. It's nothing serious. A passenger claimed she needed the lavatory, but we're preparing for descent, so we advised her to return to her seat. Daniel turned sharply, incredulous. You denied a passenger the restroom, and that's what triggered this diversion. Megan's cheeks flushed. She said it was a medical need, but passengers exaggerate all the time. She even claimed to be some kind of FAA consultant. At that, Captain Rourke's head snapped around. Her eyes blazed with sudden recognition. "What's her name?" Megan stammered. "Collins. Dr. Maya Collins." The blood drained from the captain's face. She knew the name. Everyone in aviation knew the name. Dr. Collins wasn't just a doctor. She was the authority on aerospace medicine. The woman whose research on high-altitude physiology shaped FAA regulations. The consultant whose testimony had influenced pilot fatigue rules, oxygen mask protocols, and medical emergency procedures. And Megan had just admitted they denied her a basic medical request. "Oh my God," the captain whispered. "Do you understand what you've done?" Megan faltered. She was difficult. "No." Rourke cut her off, her voice like steel. She was the one person on this plane you could not afford to dismiss. And now the FAA has intervened because of your negligence. Silence filled the cockpit, heavy and damning. Captain Rourke turned back to her instruments, jaw clenched. "Get out. Prepare the cabin for landing. And Megan, pray that Dr. Collins is merciful when this is over. Because the FAA won't be." Megan stumbled out of the cockpit. Her composure shattered. Back in the cabin, passengers were buzzing with speculation, a woman whispered. "Who's sick?" a man replied. "That doctor in row 14. They wouldn't let her use the bathroom earlier. I saw it." Murmurs spread like wildfire. Jenna's face flushed hot as she overheard. She tried to continue her duties, checking seat belts, securing trays, but every passenger's gaze felt like a silent accusation. Even those who hadn't seen the confrontation now looked at her with suspicion. Maya, still in her seat, felt the shift in atmosphere. The humiliation she had endured was transforming into something else: vindication. The passengers were beginning to see the truth. David leaned toward her, his voice low. "They're unraveling." Maya kept her eyes closed, her voice calm. "The system is correcting itself. Slowly, but surely." The engines roared louder as the plane descended through the clouds. Chicago's skyline glittered faintly in the distance. For Maya, every minute was still agony, but the knowledge that accountability was finally closing in sustained her. Jenna and Megan returned to the galley, both pale and silent. Neither dared look at Maya. They busied themselves with meaningless tasks, folding napkins that no one would use, checking already secured latches, anything to avoid facing the judgment burning in the passenger's eyes. The man across the aisle, who had been watching closely since the beginning, leaned forward again. His voice was quiet but firm, directed at Maya. "I saw how they treated you. Don't worry, we'll back you up." Maya opened her eyes, meeting his gaze. For the first time since the ordeal began, she allowed herself a small, genuine smile. "Thank you," she whispered. The landing gear thudded into place. The cabin shuddered as the aircraft descended into its final approach. Maya closed her eyes again, bracing herself for both the physical relief she desperately needed and the storm that awaited the crew. For Jenna and Megan, ignorance had been their shield. But as the wheels touched down on Chicago's runway, smooth and decisive, the shield shattered. The truth was no longer theirs to control. The plane slowed, veering away from the bustling terminals toward a remote hardstand, empty and isolated. Out the window, passengers saw black sedans and government vehicles waiting. The sight drew gasps and nervous whispers. David leaned toward Maya. "They're here for us, aren't they?" Maya nodded slowly, her voice calm. "Yes, and for them." The engines whined down to silence. The cabin felt heavy with anticipation. The door opened not to a smiling gate agent, but to stern-faced officials in dark suits. And in that moment, Jenna and Megan realized their careers weren't just in jeopardy. They were already over. The aircraft rolled to a stop on an isolated hardstand at Chicago O'Hare, far from the bustling terminals where families reunited and business travelers hurried to their gates. Here, there were no windows filled with curious onlookers, no airport announcements blaring overhead, only silence, broken by the low whine of engines winding down, and the sight of black sedans idling on the tarmac. Passengers pressed their faces to the oval windows, whispering in confusion. "Why aren't we going to a gate?" one asked. Another murmured, "Those look like government cars." The speculation was palpable. Something unusual was happening, and everyone felt it. Maya Collins sat upright, her breathing steady despite the persistent throbbing pain in her abdomen. David leaned close, his voice low, reverent. "This is it. They're here." Maya gave the faintest nod. She had envisioned what would happen when her message reached Miles Peterson. But seeing it unfold with her own eyes was another matter entirely. She felt no triumph, only a calm inevitability, as if she were watching the laws of cause and effect manifest in real time. The cabin door opened with a metallic hiss. Instead of the usual cheerful ground crew, a tall man in a sharply tailored suit stepped aboard. His presence filled the narrow entryway with authority. His voice carried without strain. "Captain Rourke." The captain emerged from the cockpit, her expression grave. "Yes, I'm Miles Peterson, Federal Aviation Administration." He didn't offer his hand. "We'll be taking it from here." Passengers erupted in murmurs. Some gasped. Others craned their necks. The weight of his title needed no explanation. Even those unfamiliar with aviation policy understood instinctively that the situation was no longer routine. Miles's gaze swept the cabin, sharp and discerning, until it landed on Maya. Recognition softened his features. He approached with professional gravity, but also unmistakable respect. "Dr. Collins," he said, inclining his head slightly. "We're here for you." With effort. Maya rose from her seat. David supported her as she stood. The pain etched into her movements, but not her composure. "Thank you for your prompt response," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "It was the least we could do." Miles replied. He gestured to an aide, who stepped forward. "We have medical staff waiting. Please allow them to escort you and your husband to a secure vehicle." As Maya and David moved down the aisle, the atmosphere shifted dramatically. Passengers, who had watched her dignity under fire, now broke into applause, hesitant at first, then swelling into a wave of support. The sound echoed through the cabin, a collective rebuke of the injustice they had witnessed. Jenna and Megan stood frozen in the galley, their faces pale. The applause wasn't for them. It was against them. Maya paused briefly near the door. Turning back to the cabin, she offered a small nod of gratitude, her composure unbroken. Then she stepped onto the jet bridge, disappearing into the care of the FAA team. Once she was gone, the tone of the operation shifted. Miles's voice hardened as he turned to the cabin crew. Purser Megan Walsh, Flight Attendant Jenna Price, Surrender your crew IDs and passports immediately. Gas rippled through the passengers. The attendants stiffened, their faces blanching. Megan tried to muster authority. "Sir, with respect, you have no authority here." Miles cut her off, his voice like granite. "You are hereby grounded pending investigation for regulatory violations and failure to address a passenger medical need. You will be escorted separately. You will not speak to each other." Jenna's composure shattered. Tears welled in her eyes. "I was just following the rules," she whimpered, her voice small and desperate. Miles's expression didn't soften. "The rules you were following don't exist. The rules you broke, however, are very real." He nodded to his aides. "Remove them." Passengers watched in stunned silence as Megan and Jenna were escorted off the aircraft. Their heads bowed, uniforms crumpled in shame. Their earlier arrogance had evaporated, leaving only fear and regret. Behind them, Ascend Airlines Vice President Frank Delaney boarded, his face thunderous. He scanned the cabin crew not as employees, but as liabilities. His voice was sharp with fury. "Do you have any idea what you've done? The fines alone will cost this company millions. And the reputational damage?" He stopped himself, pressing his lips into a hard line. "Then, to Miles," he said. "We'll cooperate fully." Miles gave a curt nod. "See that you do." The remaining attendants, wide-eyed and shaken, stood silently, realizing they were now witnesses in a federal investigation. The hierarchy of power had shifted completely. No longer protectors of procedure, they were vulnerable, exposed. Miles turned to the passengers. His tone softened, but his authority remained intact. "Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the FAA, I apologize for this disruption. The aircraft will be repositioned to a gate for deplaning. Ascend Airlines will handle your rebooking and compensation. Thank you for your patience." Passengers murmured in response. Some nodded. Others clapped softly again, not for the agency, but for Maya, the woman whose dignity had forced the skies themselves to bend toward justice. As the officials exited, David guided Maya into a waiting sedan. She leaned her head against the cool glass, the pain in her abdomen still pressing hard, but the knowledge of what had just occurred providing its own form of relief. David looked at her with quiet amazement. "I've seen plenty of courtroom takedowns," he said, "but I've never seen anything like that." Maya closed her eyes, exhaling slowly. "It wasn't a takedown," she murmured. "It was a system correcting itself." Her words lingered in the air as the sedan pulled away, carrying them toward a private lounge where medical staff waited. Back on the hardstand, Jenna and Megan sat in separate unmarked vehicles, their IDs confiscated, their futures uncertain. The weight of their choices pressed down on them harder than the silence of the cabin ever had. They were no longer the enforcers of rules. They were the ones being judged. Inside the plane, passengers exchanged hushed conversations. Some expressed outrage, others solidarity. A man near the back shook his head, muttering, "Unbelievable." "They almost got away with it," a woman replied. "Not with someone like her on board." Thank God. The truth was undeniable now. What began as a petty act of prejudice had escalated into a federal intervention. And for Maya Collins, the humiliation she endured had become the catalyst for accountability that reached far beyond herself. As the aircraft taxied toward a gate, the echoes of applause still hung in the air, a sound that would haunt Jenna and Megan far longer than the investigation itself. Because what had happened wasn't just about rules, it was about respect. And the lesson had been delivered with a force they could never forget. The sedan carrying Dr. Maya Collins and David slipped away from the hardstand, disappearing into the maze of taxiways and service roads. Inside, Maya pressed her forehead gently against the cool glass, the throbbing in her abdomen still demanding attention. A medical team waited at a secure lounge, but for now, the relief she felt wasn't physical. It was something deeper, steadier, the assurance that she had not been silenced, that the humiliation inflicted upon her had not been the final word. Beside her, David was still reeling. His legal mind replayed the scene with clinical precision. The applause of passengers, the confiscation of crew IDs, the arrival of federal officials. He had seen depositions break careers, had cross-examined witnesses until they crumbled, but nothing compared to the swiftness of what had just unfolded on that plane. He turned to her, his voice hushed. "You know this isn't just about today, don't you? This is going to explode." Maya didn't answer immediately. Her eyes stayed fixed on the blur of hangars and service vehicles outside. At last, she spoke, her tone quiet but resolute. "It has to. Back on the aircraft." The atmosphere was suffocating. With Maya gone, the applause had faded into an uneasy silence. Passengers sat stiffly, waiting for the plane to be towed to a gate. Some exchanged murmured conversations, piecing together what they had seen: the confrontation, the captain's announcement, the arrival of the FAA. Others sat in stunned silence, processing the magnitude of what had just happened. Jenna Price sat hunched in the corner of the galley, her once proud shoulders slumped. Her clipboard lay abandoned on the counter, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. The sting of the passenger's eyes lingered in her mind, eyes that had seen her not as an authority figure, but as the villain of the story. Megan Walsh sat a few feet away, her face pale and rigid. She kept replaying her conversation with Captain Rourke in the cockpit, the moment when the captain's expression had shifted from confusion to horror at the mention of Dr. Collins' name. That moment had shattered Megan's illusion of control. Now, stripped of their authority, both women were escorted separately from the plane by FAA officials. They were placed into unmarked vans and driven to a secure facility within O'Hare, where federal investigators and airline executives awaited. The interrogation rooms were cold, sterile spaces, gray walls, fluorescent lights, a metal table at the center. Jenna was seated first, a bottle of water placed in front of her she didn't touch. Two investigators entered, one from the FAA, one from Ascend Airlines' internal affairs team. Miss Price. The FAA investigator began, his tone flat, professional. "We need you to explain, in detail, why Dr. Maya Collins was denied access to a lavatory despite reporting a medical need." Jenna swallowed hard, her voice trembling. "We were preparing for descent. It's against protocol to allow passengers to move during that phase of flight." The investigator slid a document across the table. "The flight data recorder places your aircraft at cruising altitude, 37,000 feet, 94 minutes from scheduled landing. Do you want to revise your statement?" Her eyes darted to the paper, the stark numbers blurring as panic rose in her chest. I was following what I thought were the rules." The airline investigator leaned forward, his eyes sharp. "The rules you cited don't exist. What you did was deny a medical request and create a safety hazard. This isn't just poor judgment. This is misconduct." Jenna's lip quivered. "I didn't mean intent," the FAA investigator interrupted. "Does not erase impact. Dr. Collins is a federally recognized consultant. You not only ignored her disclosure, you dismissed her expertise. That decision triggered a diversion, endangered passengers, and has put both you and this airline under investigation." Jenna's composure cracked. Tears slid down her cheeks as she buried her face in her hands. The gravity of the situation crushed her. She wasn't just a flight attendant anymore. She was a liability, in a separate room. Megan faced her own interrogation. She tried to keep her tone firm, professional. The passenger was exaggerating. We had no reason to believe it was serious. The FAA investigator raised an eyebrow. No reason she identified herself as a medical doctor and FAA consultant. You dismissed her twice. Megan's jaw clenched. Passengers make claims all the time. We can't verify everything. The airline investigator's voice cut like a knife. But you didn't try to verify anything, did you? You didn't contact the cockpit. You didn't follow medical incident procedure. Instead, you chose condescension. Megan's confidence faltered. For years, she had operated under the protection of supervisors like herself, who rewarded toughness and control. But now, in the face of federal scrutiny, her shield evaporated. Hours stretched into an exhausting cycle of questioning. Every lie, every half-truth, was dismantled by data, passenger testimony, and regulations quoted verbatim. What Jenna and Megan had believed was a minor exercise of authority was exposed as a cascade of violations. Meanwhile, in a private medical suite, Maya finally found relief. The attending physician was efficient and respectful, ensuring her needs were met swiftly. David stayed close, his protective instincts on high alert. But for the first time since boarding the plane, Maya allowed herself to relax. As she lay back, sipping water slowly, her phone buzzed with a secure message. It was from Miles. Crew grounded. Full investigation underway. Media containment unlikely. Prepare for fallout. Maya handed the phone to David, who read it with raised brows. Media containment unlikely, he repeated. That means this story's going to blow wide open. Maya nodded faintly. Good. David tilted his head, studying her. Most people would want this to stay quiet. I'm not most people, Maya replied. Her voice was tired, but resolute. This wasn't just about me. It's about every passenger who's been dismissed, every person who's been humiliated, every small abuse of power that goes unchecked. If it takes my name to expose it, so be it. David reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. Then we'll face it together, outside. The story had already begun to spread. Gregory Finch, the businessman who had witnessed the confrontation and led the applause, posted a detailed account on his LinkedIn page. His words were sharp, damning, and carried the weight of first-hand credibility. I watched a black woman in visible discomfort be denied a basic human right by 2 flight attendants who dismissed her medical disclosure as inconvenience. That woman was Dr. Maya Collins, an internationally respected physician and FAA consultant. Their arrogance forced an entire aircraft to divert. What I witnessed wasn't just cruelty. It was systemic prejudice in uniform. His post gained traction within hours, shared thousands of times across professional networks. By the next morning, it would hit mainstream news, sparking outrage that Ascend Airlines could not control. But for now, inside O'Hare, the fallout was still contained within interrogation rooms and private lounges. The balance of power had shifted irrevocably. Jenna and Megan were no longer enforcers of rules. They were subjects of them. And Maya, the woman they thought they could silence, was now the catalyst of an unraveling that would reshape more than just their careers. The early morning light filtered into the private lounge at O'Hare, where Dr. Maya Collins sat wrapped in a blanket the medical staff had provided. The worst of her physical pain had finally subsided after treatment, but the ache of humiliation still lingered. David sat across from her, tapping through messages on his phone his jaw tight with concentration. "Maya," he said at last, "Gregory Finch's post has gone viral. It's already trending on multiple platforms." Maya lifted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "How many shares?" 30,000 in 4 hours. News outlets are already reaching out to him for comment. She closed her eyes briefly. It was exactly what she had anticipated and dreaded. The story was no longer confined to a plane or an investigation. It was spilling into the public square. And once that happened, there would be no containing it. David leaned forward, his voice gentler now. "You're about to become the face of something much bigger." Maya let out a slow exhale. "I never wanted that. But maybe it's what's needed." Across the airport, in a windowless room, Jenna Price sat stiffly, hands clasped together, staring down at the table in front of her. She had been questioned for hours, and the weight of her actions pressed heavier with each passing moment. Her face was streaked with dried tears, her uniform wrinkled and damp with sweat. The FAA investigator slid another file across the table. "Ms. Price, we've reviewed passenger complaints from the past 3 years. 6 involve your name, 4 from people of color, each alleging rude or dismissive treatment. Every one of those complaints was closed by your supervisor, Ms. Walsh, with the same note. Flight attendant, followed procedure. Passenger non-compliant." "How do you explain this pattern?" Jenna's throat constricted. "They were exaggerating," she muttered. "Passengers always exaggerate." The investigator's gaze hardened. "Exaggerating? Or were you encouraged to behave a certain way by your supervisor?" Her eyes flicked up, startled. "What do you mean?" The second investigator, from Ascend's Internal Affairs, leaned forward. "We've also reviewed Ms. Walsh's record. There's a pattern there, too. She shielded you repeatedly, even when other attendants raised concerns. The two of you created a culture where prejudice wasn't just tolerated, it was rewarded." Jenna's defenses cracked. "She told me to be firm. She whispered. She said some passengers, those types, always push boundaries. She said if I wanted to move up, I had to show I wouldn't bend." Her voice broke. "I thought I was proving myself. I thought I was doing what the airline wanted." The investigators exchanged glances. The admission was damning. In another room, Megan Walsh sat with her arms crossed, defiance etched into her features. She had spent the last hour insisting she had done nothing wrong, that she had been misled by a difficult passenger. But the investigators had grown tired of her narrative. "We have text messages. Ms. Walsh," the FAA investigator said, his tone calm but firm. "Messages between you and Ms. Price. Jokes about passengers. Comments about how some people always think the rules don't apply to them. Do you want us to read them aloud?" Megan's face flushed crimson. "That was private," she snapped. The investigator's voice didn't waver. "Private or not, it reveals intent. It reveals bias. And when paired with your actions on Flight 11321, it demonstrates a pattern of discriminatory behavior." "For the first time," Megan faltered, her jaw tightened, but her eyes flickered with fear. "You've been a purser for over 2 decades, the airline investigator added. "You should have known better. Instead, you modeled prejudice for the attendants under your supervision. You created this culture." Megan's silence was its own admission. Meanwhile, Captain Evelyn Rourke and First Officer Daniel Price were debriefed separately. Both were furious not only at the flight attendant's behavior, but at the betrayal of trust. Captain Rourke's voice shook with controlled anger as she spoke to the investigators. My crew never reported a thing. I found out about the medical emergency from Chicago Center. Do you know what that means? It means my ability to make informed decisions was undermined. It means they didn't just endanger one passenger. They endangered the entire flight by withholding critical information. Her words carried the weight of decades of service. The investigators took them seriously. Back in the lounge, Maya scrolled through the news on her phone. Headlines blared across every outlet. Black doctor denied bathroom on Ascend Airlines. Flight FAA orders emergency diversion. Prominent FAA consultant humiliated at 37,000 feet. Passengers' LinkedIn post sparks firestorm over airline bias. David glanced at her, concern in his eyes. It's everywhere already. They'll come after you too. Maya, the trolls, the critics. Are you ready for that? Her hand trembled slightly as she set the phone down. She wasn't immune to fear. She knew the cruelty of online mobs, the way truth could be twisted, the way dignity could be weaponized against those who sought it. But she also knew silence wasn't an option. They already tried to diminish me once, she said quietly. I won't let them do it again. The following day, Ascend Airlines executives convened in a glass-walled conference room at their Chicago headquarters. Frank Delaney, the vice president of operations, sat at the head of the table, his expression grim. Stacks of reports, transcripts, and legal briefs lay scattered across the polished surface. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, we are facing a crisis. The FAA is preparing fines. The media narrative is out of our control. And Dr. Collins is not just any passenger. She's one of the most respected voices in aviation medicine. An executive from public relations spoke up nervously. We should issue a statement, express regret, emphasize that this was an isolated incident. Frank slammed his hand on the table. Isolated. Do you think the FAA believes that? Do you think the passengers on that flight believe that we've already uncovered multiple complaints tied to these attendants, all dismissed under the same pretense? This is systemic, and pretending otherwise will make us look worse. The room fell silent. He leaned forward, his voice low and cold. We don't need a statement. We need action, immediate, visible, and painful, or this airline will not survive the storm. The weight of his words settled heavily. Everyone knew what it meant. Back in her hotel room that evening, Maya sat by the window, staring out at the skyline. The city lights flickered like distant stars, but her mind was elsewhere back on the plane, back in the aisle where Jenna had held up her palm like a stop sign, back in the moment her humanity had been reduced to non-compliance. She wrapped her arms around herself, the memory cutting deeper than the pain in her abdomen. For years, she had taught others about resilience in high-altitude environments, about how the body could adapt under pressure. But nothing had prepared her for the emotional altitude of that confrontation. David entered quietly, setting a cup of tea on the table beside her. He knelt down, his hand covering hers. You don't have to carry this alone. She turned to him, her eyes glistening. I know, but if I don't carry it, who will? For the first time since the ordeal began, her voice cracked. But beneath the vulnerability was something stronger, a determination forged in humiliation and sharpened by justice. Maya knew the fight was only beginning. And for Jenna and Megan, the cracks in their armor were widening into chasms that no amount of excuses could bridge. The storm broke fully 3 days later. By then, Dr. Maya Collins had returned home, though her phone had not stopped buzzing. Journalists, colleagues, former students, even strangers flooded her inbox with messages. Some expressed support. Others demanded statements. and a few hurled the predictable venom reserved for anyone who dared speak against entrenched power. David insisted she turn the phone off for a while. "You need rest. Maya, you've carried enough." But Maya only shook her head. "Rest is a privilege. Right now, I have responsibility." The headlines had only grown sharper. Ascend Airlines in free fall after FAA diversion. Passengers expose pattern of racism in airline cabin crews. Dr. Maya Collins breaks silence dignity at 37,000 feet. Her decision to release a short, dignified statement had turned the tide. She didn't rant, didn't accuse. She simply confirmed the fact she had been denied access to the lavatory despite a medical disclosure, and the FAA had intervened. "This isn't about me alone." The statement read, "It is about every traveler who deserves respect, safety, and dignity, no matter who they are or where they sit." That calm assertion of truth struck harder than any angry outburst could. It made her untouchable. At Ascend's headquarters, the atmosphere was suffocating. Frank Delaney sat in a boardroom filled with nervous executives, their laptops glowing with graphs of plummeting ticket sales and investor withdrawals. The airline stock had dropped nearly 20% in just 48 hours. Lawsuits loomed. He didn't bother with niceties. "We're bleeding out. The public doesn't believe our reassurances, and the FAA is sharpening its knives. We need a drastic response." One executive suggested a media campaign emphasizing diversity initiatives. Another proposed suspending Meghan and Jenna pending review. Frank cut them off with a wave of his hand. "Suspension won't cut it," he growled. "They're finished. We fire them immediately and announce it publicly. But more than that, we cooperate fully with the FAA investigation. No stonewalling, no denial. Transparency is our only survival strategy." The room fell into uneasy silence. It was one thing to fire attendants. It was another to open the books and expose the culture that had enabled them. But Frank knew there was no alternative. Meanwhile, the FAA's own investigation widened. Miles Peterson was relentless. His team pulled crew schedules, training records, complaint logs, and internal communications. Patterns emerged quickly, disturbing patterns. Multiple attendants had been protected by supervisors who dismissed complaints, particularly when passengers of color were involved. In a sterile office in Washington, Miles held up a file to his deputy. "This isn't just two rogue employees. This is a systemic failure. And if Ascend doesn't reform, they'll lose more than money. They'll lose their operating certificate." The deputy nodded grimly. "We'll push for a consent decree, mandatory training, external oversight, the works." Back in her quiet home, Maya scrolled through social media late at night, unable to sleep. Messages poured in from strangers. "I was denied boarding once because they said my ticket looked fake. They treated me like I was invisible. Thank you for speaking up. Now people will believe us." Each story weighed on her. She felt the collective ache of countless humiliations, each dismissed as policy, each endured in silence. And she realized something profound. Her ordeal had unlocked a floodgate. David found her still awake at 3 a.m., staring at the glowing screen. He knelt beside her chair, his voice soft. "You can't carry everyone's pain, Maya." Tears shimmered in her eyes. "But I can't ignore it either. All those voices, they've been waiting for someone to say what they couldn't." He pressed her hand gently. "Then say it. But on your terms. The next morning." Maya agreed to her first live interview. The news anchor asked pointed questions, fishing for outrage. Maya remained calm, her tone measured, her words precise. "I wasn't denied because of turbulence. I wasn't denied because of procedure. I was denied because two people looked at me, saw my skin, and decided I didn't deserve accommodation. That's the truth. But this isn't just about me. It's about the culture that let them believe they could act that way without consequence. The anchor leaned forward. And what consequence do you believe they should face? Maya paused, her gaze steady. Justice isn't revenge. Justice is change. I want accountability. Yes, but more than that. I want reform. I want no passenger to endure what I endured. Not tomorrow. Not ever again. The clip spread like wildfire. People weren't just sharing her story. They were quoting her words, framing them as a rallying cry. Justice isn't revenge. Justice is change. In Jenna Price's small apartment, the television blared with Maya's calm voice. Jenna sat on the couch, her eyes hollow, her phone buzzing nonstop with messages from people she once called friends. None of them offered comfort. Most cut ties. A few mocked her. Her parents called, distraught. Why would you do something like this? Her mother sobbed. Jenna didn't answer. She didn't have an answer. Megan Walsh, too, faced a brutal collapse. Her 25-year career was gone overnight. The airline had terminated her contract, revoked her pension, and barred her from future employment in aviation. She tried to defend herself online, but her words were drowned in a sea of scorn. Old posts resurfaced jokes she had made about passengers, remarks dripping with bias. They became headlines of their own. The isolation was crushing. Megan had built her identity around her uniform, her authority in the cabin. Without it, she was no one. While they unraveled, Maya stood taller than ever. Invitations poured in from universities, aviation conferences, civil rights organizations. She was asked to speak about dignity, about systemic reform, about how small abuses of power revealed larger fractures in society. At one conference, she looked out at an audience of pilots, crew members, regulators, and students. Her voice was steady, carrying across the hall. Airplanes are marvels of engineering, but no matter how advanced the machine, it still depends on people. And when prejudice guides those people, the system fails. My story is not extraordinary. It is one among many, but it should be the last of its kind. The applause was thunderous, yet, in private, Maya still wrestled with doubt. At night, she replayed the humiliation, the cold, dismissive tone of Jenna, the false authority of Megan. She questioned whether speaking out would truly change anything, or whether the industry would move on once the headlines faded. David reminded her gently, "Change doesn't happen overnight, but you've lit a fire, and it's not going out." He was right. Already. Other airlines announced reviews of their procedures. The FAA began drafting new guidelines. Passenger rights groups gained traction, citing Maya's story as proof of what they had long argued. The sky had cracked open that day over Nebraska, and now, on the ground, the ripple effect was transforming not just Ascend Airlines, but the entire industry. For Maya, the reckoning wasn't about punishment. It was about possibility. The possibility of a world where dignity wasn't negotiable, where respect wasn't conditional, where the person you underestimated turned out to be the one who changed everything. And though Jenna and Megan had tried to silence her, their downfall had become the very foundation of her rise. The conference room at FAA headquarters buzzed with restrained tension. Around the polished oak table sat senior regulators, Ascend Airlines executives, and attorneys on both sides. At the head of the table, Miles Peterson adjusted his glasses, his expression carved from stone. He had chaired countless meetings, but this one carried the weight of an entire industry. "We're not here to negotiate semantics," he began. We're here to prevent another Flight 11321. The airline's CEO, a pale man with sweat beading at his temple, cleared his throat. Mr. Peterson, Ascend is committed to Miles cut him off. Commitment without accountability is meaningless. This decree isn't optional. It's binding. Either you agree to these terms, or we move to revoke your operating certificate. Gas rippled among the executives. Losing their certificate meant grounding every aircraft, halting every operation, bankrupting the airline overnight. They had no leverage, no room to maneuver. The draft decree was laid out in black and white mandatory retraining for all 15,000 employees, external oversight for compliance, and the creation of a passenger rights division within the company, staffed by independent auditors. Most significantly, the FAA insisted that the training curriculum be designed and overseen by an external expert, one they had already chosen, Dr. Maya Collins. The name landed like a stone in still water. Executives exchanged uneasy glances, some whispering objections. Frank Delaney, grim-faced, raised his voice. "She's the one we wronged. You expect us to hand her the keys to our training program?" Miles didn't flinch. Precisely, because she's the one who understands what you've broken, and she's the one who can help rebuild it. The CEO's resistance crumbled. He signed the document with a reluctant flourish. The consent decree was official. Meanwhile, Maya herself had been preparing for this moment, though she hadn't anticipated how quickly it would come. When Miles called to inform her, she listened in silence, the weight of it settling over her. "You want me to design the program?" she asked quietly. "We need you to," Miles replied. "Not just for Ascend, but for the industry. Others will follow." Maya closed her eyes. She remembered the humiliation, the heat of pain in her abdomen, the sound of Jenna's dismissive tone, Megan's patronizing whisper. To take that pain and turn it into something constructive, it felt both daunting and necessary. "I'll do it," she said at last. Over the following months, Maya poured herself into the project. She convened a team of psychologists, diversity experts, veteran crew members, and legal advisors. Together, they built a curriculum unlike anything the airline industry had seen. It wasn't just about rules or compliance. It was about empathy, about dismantling biases crew members didn't even realize they carried. The case study at the heart of the program was anonymized but unmistakable. A black female doctor, denied dignity at 37,000 feet. Participants were forced to watch reenactments, then confront their own assumptions through guided discussion. Some resisted at first, bristling at the implication that they could harbor prejudice. But as the modules progressed, the walls came down. Crew members began to see themselves in the mirror, sometimes uncomfortably, but necessarily. Maya insisted on including passenger testimonies too. Real voices from real people who had endured small humiliations, being ignored when asking for water, being doubted when presenting tickets, being told to calm down when they were simply asserting their rights. These voices gave the program a raw authenticity no textbook could match. David watched her work tirelessly, often late into the night. He worried about her health, the strain of carrying such a monumental task. But he also saw the fire in her, the quiet determination that had carried her through humiliation and into leadership. "You're not just building a program," he told her one evening. "You're building a legacy." Maya smiled faintly, exhaustion in her eyes but resolve in her voice. Legacy is just another word for responsibility. David. And this one I can't walk away from. 6 months later, the first wave of Ascend employees completed the training. The results were immediate and profound. Attendants reported newfound awareness, pilots expressed gratitude for the perspective, and even executives admitted the process had opened their eyes. One young attendant approached Maya after a session, tears brimming in her eyes. "I didn't realize how much power we had over passengers," she confessed. "I never thought about how a simple no could humiliate someone. I'll never forget this." For Maya, those words mattered more than any headline. They were proof that change was possible, but not everyone welcomed the transformation. Former employees like Jenna Price and Megan Walsh watched bitterly from the sidelines as their names became cautionary tales. Crew lounges buzzed with whispers, "Don't pull a Jenna, don't end up like Megan." Their downfall became industry shorthand for arrogance and prejudice unchecked. Jenna struggled to rebuild her life. Job applications went unanswered once employers searched her name. She withdrew from friends, ashamed of being recognized in public. Sometimes, she scrolled through social media and saw Maya's face on news clips, speaking calmly about reform, about dignity. Each clip felt like a reminder of her own downfall. Megan fared no better. Once respected as a purser, she now lived in obscurity, cut off from the world she had dominated for decades. The bitterness ate at her, but deep down, even she knew the truth: she had crossed a line, and there was no going back. For Maya, the work extended beyond Ascend. Other airlines approached her, asking to license the program. Universities invited her to lecture. Civil rights groups sought her partnership. She became not just a survivor of injustice, but a reformer shaping the future of aviation. Yet even amid success, she wrestled with private doubt. Some nights, as she lay awake beside David, she whispered her fears. What if it's not enough? What if the system just finds new ways to humiliate people? David would hold her hand, his voice steady. It may never be perfect, but every life you touch makes the system stronger. You've already changed more than you know. Her doubts didn't vanish, but they no longer paralyzed her. She carried them as part of the work, part of the responsibility of those who dared to confront broken systems. By the end of the year, the industry had a new standard. The FAA formally adopted parts of Maya's program as a model for all U.S. carriers. News outlets hailed it as the Collins Reform. Passengers began to notice subtle but meaningful changes, attendants approaching with more patience, captains emphasizing safety and dignity in announcements, complaints taken seriously instead of brushed aside. The skies hadn't been healed overnight, but they were undeniably different. And at the heart of that difference was one woman who had refused to let humiliation define her story. She had turned pain into policy, injustice into reform, and silence into a voice that echoed through an entire industry. The consent decree wasn't just a document, it was a blueprint for dignity. And for Maya Collins, it was proof that even at 30,000 feet, where the air is thin and the world seems far away, justice could still find its wings. The following spring, the air smelled faintly of rain as Dr. Maya Collins stood on a stage in Washington, D.C., at a podium draped with the emblem of the National Air and Space Museum. The room was filled with industry leaders, lawmakers, journalists, and students. Cameras flashed, notebooks flipped open, and yet, in the middle of it all, Maya looked calm. She had stood in lecture halls before, but this was different. This was not about science. It was about justice. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice steady, "aviation is not just about machines. It's about people. It's about how we treat each other when the doors close, when the seatbelts click, and when we are suspended together miles above the earth. On Flight 1321, I was denied dignity, but that moment did not end with humiliation. It became the beginning of something larger, the Dubois Aviation Justice Project. The audience leaned in, captivated. She explained how the project would function a non-profit funded by settlement proceeds and contributions from both regulators and private donors. Its mission was clear: to provide legal aid and advocacy for travelers who experience discrimination in the air. Beyond legal support, it would develop resources, research, and educational programs to address bias in all areas of travel. David, sitting in the front row, watched her with quiet pride. He remembered her pain that day, the way she had clutched her abdomen in agony, her voice calm even as humiliation pressed down like a weight. He had seen her resilience transform into resolve, and now that resolve had become an institution. The press conference ended with a standing ovation, yet afterward, Maya slipped outside into the drizzle, needing a moment away from the clamor. She stood under the overhang of the museum's marble columns, watching raindrops scatter on the pavement. Her phone buzzed. A message from Miles Peterson. "Congratulations, Maya. You've turned turbulence into tailwinds for an entire industry." She smiled softly at the phrasing. Miles had a way with words when he chose to. That evening, at a small dinner with close friends and supporters, Maya allowed herself to exhale. For months, she had carried the weight of reform, hearings, and interviews. Tonight, she let herself be simply Maya, again a wife, a friend, a woman who had fought hard but still laughed easily when David teased her about her terrible taste in music. Still, even in laughter, the questions lingered. Would this Lastwood Airlines truly change? Or would her story fade into the noise of forgotten headlines? Later, as she prepared for bed, she voiced the worry to David. What if, 5 years from now, nothing is different? What if it was all for show? He placed his hands gently on her shoulders. Then we fight again. But think about this, Maya. How many people already feel seen because of you? How many passengers will be treated with respect tomorrow because an attendant remembers your name? That's not for show. That's real. She let the thought settle, comforted not by certainty, but by the possibility of progress. Meanwhile, the lives of Jenna Price and Megan Walsh continued to unravel. Jenna, once confident and eager, now lived in near anonymity. She stocked shelves in a hardware store, her eyes avoiding the glances of former classmates who whispered when they recognized her. Each shift was a reminder of what she had lost, not just a job, but an identity. Megan, too, struggled. She tried consulting for smaller charter services, but every application was rejected once her name surfaced. Her savings dwindled. The bitterness that once fueled her pride now curdled into regret. Late at night, she replayed her choices, the smirk she had worn in the aisle, the dismissive whisper to Maya, and for the first time, she saw them not as moments of power, but as seeds of her own downfall. The industry had moved on without them. Their names were cautionary tales whispered in crew lounges. Don't pull a Jenna. Don't end up like Megan. Maya never sought vengeance, but she understood the poetic symmetry. The same arrogance that had sought to diminish her had instead erased them. Months later, on a routine flight to Atlanta, Maya experienced a moment of quiet vindication. The seatbelt sign had just turned off when a woman 2 rows ahead pressed her call button. The attendant approached, listened carefully, then without hesitation escorted her to the nearest available lavatory, even though it was technically designated for another cabin. The entire exchange lasted less than a minute, yet Maya felt her throat tighten. She caught the attendant's eye as the woman passed by, and in that glance, she saw something profound: awareness, respect. It was a small act, invisible to most, But to Maya, it meant everything. It meant her ordeal had not been in vain. On the anniversary of the diversion, Gregory Finch, the businessman who had first shared her story, posted an update on LinkedIn. A year ago, I watched injustice at 37,000 feet. Today, I see an industry shifting because one woman refused to be silent. Dr. Maya Collins didn't just demand dignity for herself, she demanded it for all of us. And in doing so, she taught us that the skies belong to everyone. The post went viral once more, sparking renewed conversations about equity in travel. But this time, the conversation was not about outrage, it was about progress. In the quiet of her home office, Maya drafted a new speech for an upcoming aviation summit. Her words were deliberate, shaped by both science and lived experience. Every flight is a shared trust. We trust pilots with our safety, attendants with our care, and regulators with our rights. That trust is sacred. And when it is broken not by mechanical failure, but by prejudice, it is a wound that cuts deeper than any turbulence. But wounds can heal, systems can be corrected, and dignity, once defended, becomes a force stronger than fear. When she delivered that speech weeks later, the applause seemed to echo forever. For Dr. Maya Collins, the journey had begun with a denial, a closed door, a dismissive palm, a voice that said, "You'll have to wait." But it ended with open skies, new policies, and a legacy that reached far beyond one humiliating moment. The Dubois Aviation Justice Project grew steadily, offering assistance to travelers across the nation, publishing reports that shaped new laws, and training the next generation of advocates. Maya became its guiding voice, not because she had sought the role, but because she had lived the story. And whenever she boarded a plane, whether for work or for leisure, she carried with her not the memory of pain, but the knowledge that dignity was no longer an afterthought. It was policy. It was precedent. The skies were still imperfect. Prejudice had not vanished. But thanks to her, the system had begun to tilt not toward silence, but toward justice. As David often reminded her, change didn't come all at once. It came in ripples, and Maya's ripple had become a wave. Her legacy wasn't just written in court documents or consent decrees. It was written in the quiet, everyday acts of respect exchanged between strangers 37,000 feet above the earth. And that, she thought, was the truest kind of justice. What started as humiliation became transformation. Dr. Maya Collins turned pain into policy, prejudice into reform, and silence into a voice that still echoes across the skies today. The attendants who dismissed her lost everything. But Maya chose not revenge. She chose change. And because of her, passengers everywhere now travel under safer, fairer skies. Her story reminds us all dignity is not optional. Respect is not conditional. And no act of discrimination is too small to matter. Because in the end, justice has a way of finding its wings. As you leave this story, carry its weight with you. Ask yourself, how do I treat people when I think no one is watching? What small choice today could change someone's world tomorrow? If you felt anger, compassion, or hope while listening, don't let that feeling fade. Show your support by liking this video, sharing it so others can hear Maya's legacy, and subscribing to our channel for more stories that challenge, inspire, and move you. Because this isn't the end, it's just the beginning of a sky where every passenger, every person, is treated with the dignity they deserve.